My name is Olivia. I am 27 years old, and that Christmas changed everything in my life. In a house glowing with twinkling lights, as the whole family gathered around a lavish holiday table, my father suddenly spoke words that felt like a cold blade cutting through me. "You're just a burden, always have been." My mother stayed silent, and my sister Emma let out a smug laugh and said, "At least I make this family proud." I sat there, my heart tightening, the fork in my hand so heavy I could no longer move. In that instant, I put it down, stood up, and left the table without saying a single word. No one called me back, no one stood up to stop me, as if my disappearance held no value at all. They had no idea that moment was the beginning of a complete turning of the tables. Have you ever found yourself being treated like an invisible person by your own family? Tell me your story and where you're listening from so I know I'm not alone. I was born and raised in a small town in Massachusetts, where winter always lay a thick blanket of snow over the quiet streets, making them feel as if they were sleeping under a cold white quilt. For many people, childhood memories mean Christmas mornings full of laughter, surprise gifts under the green tree, and the feeling of being loved. But for me, childhood felt like a room with a window that never opened, where the light came in only faintly and the chill of indifference covered everything. From a very young age, I was branded the troublesome child, an invisible label I never had the chance to peel off. While my sister Emma was constantly praised as the shining star, the pride of the family, I seemed only to be a shadow at the edge of their compliments. Each time I brought home a drawing from school, my mother would glance at it and set it aside, while Emma needed only to hum a few notes on the piano before everyone rushed in to applaud, calling her a musical genius. I still remember very clearly the Christmas when I was 12, a memory etched so deeply it feels like a scar that never healed. The tree in the living room was lavishly decorated with strands of blinking lights and shimmering silver and red ornaments. I sat there excitedly waiting for my turn to open a gift, my heart pounding as I stared at the boxes stacked high. Emma opened hers first, a brand new mountain bike, emerald green and gleaming under the lights. She screamed with joy while my parents looked at each other, smiling with satisfaction and saying Emma deserved such a grand gift. I sat quietly, fingers tracing the edges of my small box. When I opened it, I found a set of cheap clothes, the corner of the plastic bag still bearing a clearance sticker. My mother quickly said, "Practical is always better, you need this more than some frivolous toy." In that moment, I didn't know how to react. My throat tightened and my eyes burned. Emma rode her new bike around the house, laughing, her voice echoing, while I clutched my gift to my chest, feeling as if the whole world had gone silent and left me alone with a shame no one even bothered to see. Moments like that repeated themselves over and over, not just on special occasions but in everyday life. Each time I brought home a report card full of A's, my father would say coldly, "Fine, but why not all A+? You're never good enough." Meanwhile, Emma only had to hand in an ordinary essay and my mother would boast loudly to the neighbors, so proud it was as if she had just been accepted to NASA. At the dinner table, every conversation revolved around Emma's achievements and her bright future. I sat at the far end, quietly eating my portion, feeling as though if I stayed silent everything would somehow be better for everyone. That favoritism slowly sank into my mind, making me believe I really was a burden, an invisible person. There were nights when I lay in my room hearing Emma laughing with my mother out in the living room while I buried my tears under the pillow. I tried everything to make them proud, joining the school basketball team, winning a county-level literary award, yet I never received any real recognition. Instead, my father always found a way to tear me down. "You were just lucky. Don't think you're anything special." The peak of that injustice came when I was seriously ill and had to stay in the hospital for a week. I remember my mother stopping by only a few times, hurrying as if she might miss one of Emma's concerts. While I lay alone in the hospital room, quietly watching the IV drip into my body, I realized my place in the family had never been and would never be important. My father even scolded me for being such a nuisance, too expensive, as if getting sick was somehow my fault. During those years, I began to close myself off. I spoke less, shared less, and learned to hide my pain behind a forced smile. I became the kid who spent hours alone in the library, losing myself in books to escape the indifference and harsh comparisons at home. But no matter how hard I tried, I carried the constant feeling that I was just the extra in my own family, a faded side character in a story my parents seemed to write only for Emma. When I turned 18, I thought everything would change. I believed that if I left the house in Massachusetts and proved myself through my own hard work, my parents would finally have to see me differently. The path I chose was college. Unlike Emma, who had been given every resource, private tutors, extra classes, and full financial support, I had to figure things out on my own, relying on public libraries and sheer persistence. I poured sweat and tears into earning a full scholarship to the State University of New York. It was the only ticket I had to step out of the shadow they had cast over me since childhood. I still remember the day I received my acceptance letter. My heart was bursting with joy as I carried it, hands trembling, to show my parents, hoping they would be proud. But my father's only response was, "Well, at least you won't have to take out loans." My mother immediately compared me to Emma. "Getting into Yale is what's truly impressive. Your school, it's just a state school." While I struggled to calculate every dollar for meals, books, and transportation, my parents poured tens of thousands of dollars into Emma's education. They covered the full tuition at Yale, rented her a private apartment near campus, and even bought her a car. I watched all of this with a mix of sadness and resentment. I never expected the same treatment, but deep down I longed for just a little fairness, just a little recognition. Instead, all I received were comparisons and belittlement. During my college years, I had to study and work at the same time just to make ends meet. In the mornings I worked as a waitress at a cafe, in the afternoons as a teaching assistant in the library, and at night I buried myself in textbooks in my dorm until late. Some days I was so exhausted I fell asleep right at my desk, but I never allowed myself to give up. I knew that if I wasn't strong, no one would step in for me. I remember one holiday break when I went home. Emma was proudly showing off her internship at a major law firm secured through our parents' connections. I stayed quiet, stuffing my cafe uniform into a bag to be washed so no one would see it. But my father still found out and spat out a bitter remark. "How shameful, a daughter of this family serving tables for strangers." I pressed my lips together and swallowed my tears. They didn't understand that it was that very job keeping my dream alive, while they saw it as humiliation. 4 years passed, and I graduated with honors in marketing. I thought at the very least they would smile proudly at me. But on graduation day, my parents didn't even bother to attend. They claimed they were busy with work, but in reality they were at a partner's anniversary party with Emma's family. I walked across the stage quietly, accepting my diploma to the applause of strangers, and once again reminded myself, I have to recognize myself, because no one else ever will. After graduating, I started working at a small advertising agency in New York. The salary wasn't high, but I lived frugally, saving every dollar until I was finally able to buy a small apartment in Brooklyn. It was the first home I could truly call my own, a place where I could close the door and no longer hear comparisons or criticism. To me, it was a symbol of independence, proof of my own strength. But when I excitedly shared the news with my parents, they responded with indifference. "Brooklyn? That's just an ordinary place, nothing special. It's like a rat's nest compared to Emma's home." My mother sighed and added, "Other people's daughters marry rich husbands and live in penthouses in Manhattan, while you're holed up in a tiny apartment. How is that success?" I sat there listening, my heart aching, but my face stayed calm. I knew that in their eyes, a woman's worth didn't lie in standing on her own 2 feet, but in marrying someone wealthy. And Emma, with her lavish marriage to a young businessman, was their golden ticket to show off to friends and neighbors. They boasted proudly about their successful son-in-law and the expensive gifts Emma received, while every time they mentioned me, they would only shrug. "She just does marketing, she manages to get by." That phrase, "gets by," cut into me like a knife, because I had poured all my strength into building a decent life. Yet no matter how hard I tried, in their eyes I was still a failure. Emma was celebrated not because of her own merit, but because she knew how to bask in someone else's glow. But my parents never saw that. And perhaps it was from those wounds that I grew up with a tougher shell, yet inside I carried cracks no one could see. I had learned how to survive in a family that valued outward pride more than real love. But deep down in my heart, I still longed for the day someone would finally look at me with recognition, for a place where I would no longer be seen as a burden. I didn't yet know that the path ahead would continue to test me and lead me to the defining moment of the Christmas dinner at 27, when all my years of patience would shatter like glass. That Christmas, at 27, Massachusetts lay buried in white snow. Flakes drifted slowly past the window, reflecting the golden light spilling from the house where I had grown up. I drove back to my parents' home with a heavy heart, part hope and part dread. For years I had tried to fulfill my duty, showing up at family gatherings only to leave with another invisible wound. But Christmas was still Christmas, I told myself, and I didn't want to be the daughter branded irresponsible for not coming. I carried a small gift wrapped in plain green paper, inside a wool scarf I had picked out at a local shop. I knew it wasn't luxurious, but I believed sincerity could sometimes make up for material things. The house was filled with the smell of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce. The table was set lavishly, red wine glistening in crystal glasses. The whole family sat gathered together, the atmosphere lively but laced with a quiet tension that only I seemed to feel so clearly. Emma walked in wearing a sparkling red dress, her hair curled in perfect waves, and around her neck hung a diamond necklace that caught every light. She beamed as she showed it off. "This is my Christmas gift from my husband, $12,000. My parents immediately gasped in admiration, praising their generous son-in-law, then turned to the neighbors seated at the table to brag further. Their eyes glowing with pride as if that gift were their own accomplishment. I sat silently, my small box resting in front of me, my hand suddenly feeling meaningless. When it was time to open presents, I handed the scarf box to my mother. She forced a faint smile and set it aside without a single word of praise. Emma quickly chimed in. "So cute, Olivia. Must have been a winter clearance sale, huh?" Laughter erupted around the table, and I heard my father's voice slip in among the chuckles. "You're always the same, never able to do anything worthwhile." I pressed my lips tightly together, forcing myself to swallow the piece of turkey in my mouth. The room quieted slightly as everyone began to eat. I stared at the fork in my hand, listening to the chatter and laughter around me, feeling like an outsider in my own family. Then, out of nowhere, my father dropped a hammer of words. "You're just a burden, always have been." For a heartbeat, the room fell completely silent before Emma let out a laugh and added, "At least I make Mom and Dad proud, Olivia. Unlike you, I actually know how to make people proud." Her voice dripped with mockery, her eyes glinting with smug satisfaction. I froze, my heart tightening, blood rushing to my face. Over the years, I had endured countless cruel remarks, but never before had my father said something so bluntly in front of everyone. I waited for my mother to intervene, to offer even the smallest defense, but she only bent her head and cut another piece of turkey as if nothing had happened. In that moment, I understood the truth. They had never really seen me as a valued part of the family. I looked around the table, the glinting wine glasses, the chandelier lights reflecting off Emma's diamond necklace, the clinking of cutlery, and the pitying eyes of a few distant relatives. I felt so small I could hardly breathe. My hand trembled, and the fork slipped onto the plate with a sharp sound cutting through the noise. I took a deep breath and set it down completely. No explanation, no tears. I stood up, pushed the chair back, and walked away. The sound of my heels echoed across the wooden floor. No one rose to stop me, no one called my name, no hand reached out to hold me back. Only Emma's half-laugh trailed behind me, and the heavy silence of my parents lingered in the air. When the door closed behind me that Christmas night, I knew I had stepped out of a house that had long since stopped being a home. The road back to Brooklyn was eerily quiet. Snow fell thick, blanketing the streets, the wipers sweeping rhythmically across the windshield as if erasing the echoes of what had just happened. I drove slowly, my mind blank, but in my chest, my heart pounded, aching and yet somehow freed. When I finally reached my small apartment, I stood still in the dark, the street lamp spilling a dim golden glow through the window. I let out a long breath and sat down on the wooden chair by the table, the silence of the room so complete I could hear the wind whistling in the hallway outside. The next morning, I opened my laptop and did something I had never dared to imagine all those years. I logged into my bank account and turned off the autopay I had secretly set up to cover the mortgage on my parents' house. I also canceled every reminder I had placed on my calendar. In that instant, it felt as if a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I opened a new Excel file and began recalculating my entire personal budget. I split it into columns: rent, food, savings for the future. For the first time, the numbers lined up neatly, cleanly, no longer tied to a house where I had never truly been welcome. I carefully saved the file under the name Life Budget, only me. No explanation, no tears. I stood up, pushed the chair back, and walked away. The sound of my heels echoed across the wooden floor. No one rose to stop me. No one called my name. No hand reached out to hold me back. Only Emma's half-laugh rang out behind me, and my parents' heavy silence filled the room. When the door closed behind me that Christmas night, I knew I had stepped out of a house that had long since stopped being a home. The road back to Brooklyn was eerily still. Snow fell thick and white, covering the pavement, the wipers brushing rhythmically across the windshield as if wiping away the echoes of what had just happened. I drove slowly, my mind blank, but inside my chest, my heart pounded, aching and yet somehow freed. When I reached my small apartment, I stood quietly in the dark, the streetlights spilling a dim golden glow through the window. I exhaled deeply, then sat down on the wooden chair by the table, the room so silent I could hear the wind whistling in the hallway outside. The next morning, I opened my laptop and did something I had never dared to do all those years. I logged into my bank account and turned off the autopay I had secretly set up to cover the mortgage on my parents' house. I canceled every reminder I had placed on my calendar. In an instant, it felt as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I opened a new Excel file and began recalculating my entire personal budget. I divided it into columns: rent, food, savings for the future. For the first time, the numbers appeared neat and clean, no longer tied to a house where I had never truly been welcome. I carefully saved the file under the name Life Budget, only me. Many nights I sat writing in my journal, letting the words flow out as a form of healing. I wrote about a forgotten childhood, about all the times I tried to make them proud only to be met with cold, dismissive eyes. I wrote about that final Christmas dinner, where laughter and accusations shattered the last fragments of patience I had left. And then I wrote about how it felt to sit here now, alone but free. I didn't know what the future would look like, but for the first time, I felt I had the right to choose for myself. Yet, even in the quiet, the pain still existed. Some mornings I would wake up, stare at an empty phone screen, and feel my heart sink. I missed the sound of my name being called, even if it had been in phone calls full of blame. I missed the familiar noise of family, even though it had always suffocated me. But instead of letting the ache pull me back, I turned it into a reminder. I deserved better than that. In the stillness, I also began to realize something. My silence wasn't just self-protection, it was an undeniable answer. It was like a mirror held up to my parents and to Emma, forcing them to face the consequences of losing a daughter, a sister they had always labeled a burden. I didn't yet know how they would react, but I knew one thing for sure. Their lives would not go on as smoothly as before without my quiet contributions. About 3 weeks after that Christmas night, when the holiday lights on the streets had begun to dim and New York City was slipping back into its busy rhythm of the new year, I was sitting in my small apartment when the phone rang. On the screen appeared a familiar name. Dad. My heart dipped. How long had it been since he last called? I stared at the screen, my finger hesitating over the answer button. Finally, I drew a deep breath and picked up. His voice came through, with no greeting, straight to the point, urgent, tinged with anger. "Olivia, what's going on? Why hasn't the house mortgage been paid?" "They just called today, said it's already overdue by a few days." For a moment, it felt like I was listening to an old recording. The same commanding tone, the same way of treating me like a tool to fix their problems. Only this time, I was no longer the silent daughter taking the blame. I let out a cold half-smile, pressed the phone to my ear, and answered slowly, each word clear. "Ask your pride and joy." On the other end, there was a beat of silence before his voice rose in a furious shout. "What are you talking about? This is the family home, not some joke. If it isn't paid, the bank is going to make this a big problem." I closed my eyes and pictured his face flushed red with rage. I imagined my mother standing nearby, her eyes anxious, and Emma frowning in irritation, unable to grasp how the joyful Christmas dinner had so quickly unraveled into chaos. What they never expected and never once admitted was that their perfect house had only survived this long because of me. Years ago, when my father failed in a real estate investment and the family fell into financial trouble, they no longer had the credit to keep the house. It was me, with my fledgling marketing job and a modest savings account, who agreed to co-sign the mortgage so the bank would approve their refinancing. I signed the papers without complaint, just hoping to keep the family afloat. I remember that day clearly. My father wouldn't look me in the eye, just pushed the folder across the table and said, "Sign it. This is the only way to keep the house." My mother whispered, "Emma's still in school. You're the older sister. You have to shoulder this." And I, out of lifelong habit, nodded, signed my name, and accepted yet another burden. After that, no one ever mentioned my part in it. They went on bragging to the neighbors about a home built from Mom and Dad's hard work. Emma kept bringing her friends over for parties while I quietly paid the bills, as if it were simply my duty. They never imagined I could stop. In their eyes, I was the black sheep, the burden, but also an endless backup wallet. Now, hearing my father panic as the bank calls about overdue payments, I felt a sweet reversal. After years of feeling like the one who didn't belong, I finally realized it was they who had been depending on me to sustain their illusion of a perfect family. I let out a slow breath and answered in a voice so calm he probably didn't expect it. "I stopped paying after Christmas. I think it's time everyone takes care of the house you're all so proud of yourselves." "How ting." On the other end of the line, his voice came back sharp, edged with panic. "You can't do this. This is our home." I replied softly. "No, this is your and Emma's home. I was just the name you pulled in when you needed it. If I'm only the burden you said I was, then don't expect anything from me anymore." Then I hung up. The cold beep echoed like a period at the end of a long sentence. I set the phone down on the table and looked out the window. The snow had stopped falling, but patches of white still streaked the road. Inside me rose a strange feeling, not sadness, not anger, but calm. With a single press of a button, I had begun to crack the picture-perfect family portrait they had painted for so many years. They had never imagined I had that kind of power, but my silence and my decision were the counterstrike no one expected. I didn't feel glee, but I didn't feel guilt either. I just felt light, because for the first time, I had put myself first. And I knew this was only the beginning of the collapse, something they would now have to face without me standing behind them, patching everything up. In the days following that call, my silence slowly turned into a storm inside the house in Massachusetts. I didn't witness it firsthand, but the shards of their panic reached me through dozens of missed calls and a flood of voicemails from my father. Within a week, my inbox was filled with his voice shaky, angry, then gradually slipping into pleading. "Olivia, pick up the phone. This is serious, not a joke. The bank has sent a letter. They say they'll begin foreclosure if it isn't paid. You know this, you can't just walk away." I listened to those words but felt no guilt like before. Instead, I sat in my small Brooklyn apartment under a warm yellow lamp, sipping tea, listening as though it were a news report about strangers, nothing to do with me. My father called so often the phone buzzed constantly on the table. When I didn't answer, he left voicemails several minutes long. At first, his voice still carried authority. "Olivia, you're not allowed to do this. This is your responsibility. You signed, you have to keep paying." But as the days passed, that authority cracked, replaced by panic. "Honey, the bank has sent the final notice. They're bringing in lawyers. If we lose this house, how will we face the neighbors?" And finally, in a voicemail I still have saved, his voice was hoarse, almost breaking. "Please, sweetheart, don't let the house be taken. You're the only one who can save us." That was the moment I realized the balance of power in the family had completely shifted. For years, I had been treated as a burden, a shadow, something unnecessary, when in reality it was they who had been living off me to maintain their illusion of a perfect family. An illusion they flaunted to the neighbors, boasting about the younger daughter who married rich, the beautiful house, the comfortable life. But behind the glittering lights, everything was rotten, and now the glossy paint on the surface was peeling beyond repair. In their desperation, my parents turned to Emma and her husband. I learned this from a kind neighbor who occasionally called to check on me. "Your parents have been shouting at Emma," she told me, "demanding that she and her husband take responsibility since you've walked away." But her husband was firm. He said the house isn't his responsibility. Even outsiders felt awkward hearing it. I pictured the scene: Emma, so used to being indulged, standing stunned as her wealthy husband flatly refused. That diamond necklace she had flaunted at Christmas dinner surely couldn't be exchanged for a check big enough to save the house now. The neighbors began to whisper. The house, once called the pride of the street, had suddenly become the subject of gossip. Overdue envelopes stamped with the bank's logo piled up in the mailbox by the front gate, impossible to hide. I imagined my mother in the kitchen, hands trembling as she tore open a letter, then sinking into a chair, staring at the same kitchen that used to be lively during the holidays, now filled with dread. My father, restless, pacing the living room, phone glued to his hand, calling me, then the bank, then arguing with Emma again. Meanwhile, I stayed in Brooklyn, calm as though I had never been tied to that house at all. In the evenings, I lit scented candles, played soft jazz, and filled more pages in my journal about this new journey of freedom. I felt no gloating, but no pity either. This wasn't some cold-blooded revenge. It was the inevitable consequence of years of being ignored and used. I had simply stopped fueling their elaborate machine, and immediately, it ground to a halt. I thought about all the times they had bragged to the neighbors about Emma, about the lavish parties in that big house, about the younger daughter who married rich. Not once had they ever spoken of me with pride. And now, with the bank threatening foreclosure, the neighbors would know everything. The velvet curtain over their model family stage had fallen, exposing the truth. They weren't perfect, only weak people clinging to the money of a child they themselves had rejected. One afternoon, sitting in my usual cafe, I opened my voicemail and listened to my father's trembling voice. "Olivia, don't do this, we're family." I let out a quiet laugh, a smile both sad and relieved. Family? If we were truly a family, would I be sitting here alone, listening to these too late pleas? In that moment, I knew for certain, what was collapsing wasn't just a house, but the illusion that had held me captive for 27 years. And that collapse, though painful for them, was the moment of release for me. One late January afternoon, with snow still piled thick on the sidewalks of Brooklyn, there was a pounding knock at my door. My heart tightened instantly. I knew exactly who it was. For weeks their voices had been filling my voicemail, moving from anger to pleading. I walked slowly to the door and looked through the peephole. Just as I'd guessed, my parents stood there, faces gaunt, eyes shadowed, heavy coats dusted with snow. They no longer had their usual proud posture, but looked like two people clinging desperately to whatever hope remained. I opened the door, but only a narrow crack. My mother spoke first, her voice trembling. "Olivia, sweetheart, we need to talk, please. Help us this one time. The bank won't give us any more time. If we lose the house, how will we live?" I stood still, my hands gripping the doorframe to steady myself. Her eyes were pleading, but I also remembered all the times those same eyes had looked right through me as if I didn't exist. My father cut in, his tone harder. "You can't just abandon us like this. You signed your name, you're responsible. If you don't save us, the whole family will be disgraced in front of the neighbors. What will they think of us?" I drew a deep breath, then opened the door wider, but instead of inviting them in, I stood squarely in the doorway like a wall. For the first time in my life, I didn't bow my head, didn't stay silent, didn't try to smooth things over. I looked my father straight in the eye and said, my voice steady and firm, "I'm no longer the shadow carrying everyone else's debts. I deserve to live my own life." The words came out so strong that even I was surprised by them. Both of them froze. My mother raised a hand to her mouth as if she'd just heard something terrible. My father's face flushed red, anger flaring. "You're so selfish, Olivia, you're ungrateful. We raised you, fed you, gave you an education, and now you turn your back on us?" I gave a bitter, almost relieved smile. "Raised me, fed me, gave me an education?" I stressed each word. "Did you ever once see me as a person with value? I had to fight for scholarships, study, and work at the same time just to survive, while Emma had all her tuition paid, a car, an apartment. I signed that mortgage just to help you, but what did I get in return? A thank you? No. Just more insults, more times being called a burden. If that's what you call raising me, then you paid for it with injustice and damage." My mother burst into tears, and my father roared, "You really are an ungrateful child. We gave you a chance, and this is how you repay us. You're no different from a stranger off the street." I didn't shed a tear like I used to. I looked at them calmly, my shoulders straight, my voice firm and clear. If being selfish is what it takes to protect myself, then it's never a sin. And if choosing not to be the daughter of a family that only knows how to belittle me makes me an outsider, then I would rather be a stranger than stay. The air went still. Outside, the wind hissed through the cracks of the door as if echoing my words. My parents stared at me for a long moment, as if unable to believe that the daughter who had always stayed silent now dared to stand up to them. At last, my father spun on his heel and strode heavily down the stairs, while my mother kept looking back at me, eyes red but saying nothing more. The door closed behind them, leaving me in my small apartment filled with quiet. My heart was beating fast, but there was no more fear. I felt a new kind of strength, a boundary that had finally been drawn. From that moment on, I knew I had broken free from the chains of scolding, favoritism, and invisible burdens. I was no longer the daughter called a burden. I was myself, and I had chosen to protect me. Alongside therapy, I also began building a family of choice, a family I chose for myself, not one forced upon me. I spent more time with Rachel, a close colleague at the ad agency, someone who always listened without judgment. Rachel pulled me into her circle of friends, people who had also come from difficult pasts and were searching for a community to lean on. We often gathered on weekends, cooking together, sharing personal stories without ever fearing ridicule. I also joined a support group for adults who had grown up in toxic families. There, for the first time, I heard stories so much like mine, some even worse. I realized I wasn't alone. When a middle-aged woman shared that her mother once called her the biggest mistake of my life, I broke down in tears because I heard myself in her words. We hugged each other, wiped each other's tears, and I felt a connection that my own blood family had never given me. As time passed, I noticed my smile changing. It was no longer forced, no longer a mask to hide my sadness, but real smiles that rose from deep within. I began to savor the small things, an early morning walk in the park, a book half finished, or simply the sunlight streaming through the window of my apartment. I bought a few more plants to line the windowsill, hung up colorful paintings gifted by friends. The apartment that was once silent now felt warm, as if it were reflecting the changes happening inside me. That New Year's Eve, I hosted a small gathering in my apartment. There was no turkey or diamond necklaces, just hot pizza, a few bottles of cheap wine, and lively music. Rachel, my new friends, and even a couple of friendly neighbors came. We crowded into the little living room, raising our glasses to the new year. Laughter rang out, the glow of string lights flickering across everyone's faces. When the clock struck midnight, we all counted down together and hugged. Standing in the middle of those arms, I felt a strange, glowing warmth in my chest. For the first time in my life, I felt I truly belonged to a family not bound by blood, but built on care and respect. When everyone had left, I sat back down on the chair, looking at the glasses still foaming with wine and the crumbs left on the table. I let out a soft laugh. I had once dreamed of a party like this in the house in Massachusetts, but that dream had never come true. Yet here, in this tiny apartment, I had found what I had longed for, a home of the heart. I opened my journal and wrote the final lines of the old year. I am no longer the child forgotten on Christmas night. I am no longer the one carrying debt for a family that only belittled me. I am Olivia. I have friends, a community, and I am learning to love myself. If I have one wish for the new year, it is simply to keep living fully like this. Putting the pen down, I lifted my head to the window. Fireworks burst across the city sky, their light glinting off the glass like a new promise. And I smiled, for the first time in years, with a heart truly at peace. Many years have passed since that first New Year's Eve I spent with friends in Brooklyn. I have come a long way from the 27-year-old girl dismissed by her own family to the woman in her 30s who now stands confidently on her own feet. My life is no longer centered on seeking my parents' approval or trying to prove anything to Emma. Instead, it revolves around what I truly want, the people I value, and the family I have chosen to build. My career turned to a new chapter as well. From a marketing staffer at a small firm, I pushed myself to learn, to grow, and to take on every challenge. I stayed up late polishing ad campaigns, not for praise, but because I genuinely loved the work I was doing. Step by step, I was promoted from team leader to department head, and finally, at 36, I took the seat as creative director of a major New York agency. On the day of my appointment, I remember standing before the mirror in my office and telling myself, "This is mine. No one can take this away." Alongside my career, my heart found its home too. I met Daniel, a young architect, during a campaign to promote a new project. We started with work conversations, then slowly shared more about our lives. He never looked down on my past, never tried to fix me. He simply listened, held my hand, and said, "You don't have to prove anything. You're already enough." Those simple words carried the power to erase years of rejection. We married in a small ceremony, no noise, no show. Only our closest friends, the ones I call family, stood around us, blessing our union. A year later, I gave birth to my first daughter and named her Grace. As I held her in my arms, looking at her tiny face sleeping peacefully, I whispered, "You will never have to feel like a burden. You will grow up knowing you are worthy of love, simply because you are you." In that moment, it felt like another layer of healing. I understood that the cycle of injustice and hurt stopped with me. I would not pass it on to the next generation. The apartment Daniel and I lived in wasn't far from my old place in Brooklyn, but it was larger and filled with light. On the living room wall, I hung one particular photograph, the Christmas dinner table from years ago, with the empty chair I left behind. I kept it not to nurture resentment, but as a reminder of boundaries. Every time I looked at that picture, I remembered that night and told myself, I once had the courage to stand up and walk away from a place that had no room for me, and because of that, I now have this life. One winter evening, as the city outside glowed with lights, I sat beside Grace, reading her a children's book. Daniel rested his hand gently on my shoulder, his eyes soft. I smiled and whispered aloud, "Family isn't about blood, it's about the ones who choose to stay." Those words were not just a reminder for me, but a promise to my daughter. That real family is built on love, respect, and presence. And if you are listening to this story, if you've ever been called a burden, remember that you don't need anyone's stamp of approval to exist. You don't have to live to please your parents, your siblings, or anyone who tells you that you are not enough. You have always been enough, from the very moment you came into this world. The most important recognition is the one that comes from yourself, and sometimes from the people you choose as your family. My life has taught me one thing. Silence is not weakness, sometimes it is strength. Walking away is not failure, it is the first step to finding yourself. And family is not the place where you were born, but the place where you are loved. Looking back on the path I have traveled, I know that Christmas night was the beginning of the journey that shaped who I am today. I am no longer a shadow, no longer the child dismissed as unworthy. I am Olivia, a woman, a mother, a friend, and above all, myself. Whole and enough.